How George Walker Bush decided.
Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? Do the values that support American democracy, as well as other Western democracies, have their basis in Christianity? This is a view held by many, especially those on the right wing of American politics or European politics, but it is an erroneous view, and it's a view that I analyze and criticize in my book, Against the New Politics of Identity. I'm Ronald Lindsay. I'm a lawyer and philosopher by training, and currently I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Inquiry. Some on the right yearn for a return to a mythical past where everything was good and just and harmonious because nations in the West had a Christian identity. In fact, the catchphrase for the Trump political movement, "Make America Great Again," captures nicely the mindset and ambitions of Christian nationalists. They seek what they contend is a restoration of America's Christian orientation and values, a return to a past where America was great precisely because it embodied Christian principles. Well, what is the basis for the claim that the United States is a Christian nation? There are two principal arguments. First, Christian nationalists maintain that the founders of the United States, people like Madison, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, so on, intended to establish a Christian nation. And second, that the structure and fundamental laws of the United States reflect a Christian worldview. The historical claims of the Christian nationalists are without foundation. Indeed, the claims of the Christian nationalists represent a complete distortion of the historical record. To begin, Christian nationalists rely on various statements and actions by some of the founders to argue they were devout Christians, and therefore they must have intended to establish a Christian nation. That claim is factually flawed and illogical. Yes, many founders were Christians, but a good number were just what we would today call cultural Christians. In fact, influenced by the Enlightenment, many founders were rationalist in their approach to religion. That is, they rejected revelation as a guide to religious truth, which of course meant they did not rely uncritically on the Bible. Sure, many founders attended church, celebrated Christian holidays, or perhaps engaged in some religious rituals, but they did so without accepting key Christian doctrines, such as the divinity of Christ. More important, it does not follow from the fact that some founders were Christian that they intended to establish a Christian nation. Indeed, we have clear documentary evidence to the contrary, namely the United States Constitution. The Constitution established a secular republic. There's no statement anywhere in the Constitution suggesting in any way that its provisions derive from the Bible or Christian principles. Nor is there any hint that the government should collaborate with or support religious bodies. Furthermore, the Constitution makes clear that the government derives no authority from a deity. Authority is derived from the consent of the governed, not the grace of God. As stated by the preamble to the Constitution, we the people have established the government. The complete absence of any reference to God or Jesus Christ or Christianity in the body of the Constitution undermines the Christian nation thesis. If the founders want to ensure a government based on Christian precepts, why isn't God or Jesus or Christianity invoked in the text of the document? The authors of the Constitution could have easily ensured that their supposed intent to create a Christian state would be understood by adding a few words to the preamble. They could have worded the opening clause in the preamble to include the phrase, "in order to found a more perfect union based on Christian principles." It would have taken little effort to include those 4 words. Christian nation advocates want us to believe that Christianity was of central importance to the founders, and they wanted the new nation to be based on Christian principles, yet the founders could not be bothered to make any reference to these principles in the Constitution. Another argument by Christian nationalists avoids direct reliance on the founders' religious beliefs or their supposed intentions. Rather, it asserts that biblical precepts are reflected in the values that shaped the institutions of American democracy. On this view, the founders did not have to make explicit their intention to create a Christian nation. The government they organized and the legal system they implemented manifest their Christian or Judeo-Christian values. I'm sure this argument in one form or another is familiar to many of you. Judeo-Christian values supposedly constitute the foundation for our democracies. This argument is unsound in every possible way. The values that support American or modern European democracy have no connection to biblical precepts, which, if anything, support anti-democratic institutions. Let us start our analysis by identifying the principles underlying our democracies. That government authority derives from the consent of the governed is an obvious one. The separation of powers is also fundamental. certainly for American democracy, as shown by the very structure of the Constitution, which establishes three co-equal branches of government. That government authority over the lives of individuals is limited is another. And of course, the rights set forth in the American Bill of Rights and comparable lists of rights in European constitutions must be respected by the government. So is Christianity the source for these principles? First, we need to bear in mind that Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism. Indeed, one cannot accept Christian doctrine without also accepting the Old Testament as divinely inspired. And the Old Testament reports that the ancient Israelites had no trouble accepting monarchical or oligarchical governments. Moreover, the book of Leviticus expressly authorizes enslavement of non-Jews. To put it mildly, individual freedom was not a cornerstone value in ancient Israel. Respect for individual freedom did not exactly surge once Jesus appeared on the scene. According to the New Testament, no word condemning slavery passed his lips, although he had plenty to say about the evils of fornication. The Apostle Paul referred on several occasions to slavery without condemning the practice. Regarding democratic government, Jesus was also silent. Implicitly, he condoned Rome's authoritarian rule by advising to render to Caesar those things that are Caesar's. That those in charge of the state had been ordained by God and were entitled to absolute obedience was a key element of Christian political thought from late Roman times forward. Monarchs ruled by divine right. They were anointed by God. With respect to the separation of powers, its lack of direct association with Christian precepts should be apparent. All the monarchs over the centuries who ruled with the approval of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, or later Protestant religious leaders ruled, for the most part, absolutely, combining executive, legislative, and judicial functions. The only limit religious leaders tried to impose on the ruler's power related to the perceived prerogatives of religious bodies. The principle that government has limited authority and that one of government's primary obligations is to protect the liberty of its people is definitely not a product of Christianity. After Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and through the Middle Ages up into early modern Europe, the prevailing understanding was that government had the obligation to ensure its subjects lived in accordance with God's law, as then interpreted. Consistent with that obligation, the government had the duty to control the lives of its subjects, lest they endanger their immortal souls and the souls of others. Hence the Inquisition and other measures to ruthlessly suppress heresy. Again, the Reformation did little to change this political philosophy. The notion that the government had an affirmative obligation to guard against heresy, and in doing so, the authority to restrain the freedom of its people, persisted after the Reformation. Protestant states condemned heretics to death as surely as Catholic states. The view that government had a duty to guard against religious error carried over into some early American colonies. The Puritans of Massachusetts persecuted dissenters in their midst, just as they had been persecuted in England. To sum up, there's no evidence that Christian doctrines, principles, or values provided the foundation for America's constitutional democracy. To the contrary, throughout history, nations that had governments charged with promoting Christian values had shown themselves to be hostile to the freedoms valued by the founders of American democracy, and the founders were aware of this unhappy history. The democratic governments that emerged, first with the American Republic, and then through the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe, have all been products of the Enlightenment, that intellectual, philosophical, and political movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries. I've referred now several times to Enlightenment values, so you might well ask, precisely what are the values that the Enlightenment has bequeathed to us? At the core of Enlightenment thought was the rejection of the claims of special authority claimed by the Church. Truth was determined through empirical evidence and sound reasoning, not through revelation. Because no institution or person can claim special authority, no statement made by anybody has any more validity than the reasoning and evidence offered in support of it. The Enlightenment notion that truth is available to all, provided they have sufficient support for their assertions, had further implications. One, it placed a value on empirical inquiry, giving further impetus to the scientific revolution that was already underway. Two, it placed a value on a culture of free speech. If no one is in a privileged position to discern the truth, then criticism of knowledge claims must be open to everyone. Three, it lends support to democratic government. Again, if no one has a position of special authority, then everyone should have a say in decisions about governance, and political authority is derived from the people through their consent. 3 other Enlightenment values are also significant. Religious dogma had insisted on the notion of absolute truth. Enlightenment thinkers accepted the idea of probabilistic truth and were prepared to live without uncertainty. This idea fostered greater tolerance for diverging opinions. Enlightenment thinkers placed value on personal freedom, at first principally with respect to religious and political freedom. However, once the value of personal freedom was recognized, the scope of personal autonomy increased over time. Many people today have more say over the direction of their lives, what career to pursue, whether and whom to marry, whether to stay married, whether to bear children, than any other sizable group in human history. Along with the value of personal freedom, the Enlightenment thinkers promoted the notion of universal human rights, a notion alien to almost everyone prior to the 18th century. Let me pause here to address one obvious objection to my overview of Enlightenment values, and that is that equal human rights for some Enlightenment thinkers meant only equal human rights for white males, as indicated by the continuation of slavery in the United States and the continuation of the subordination of women throughout the Western world. This is one reason some on the left disparage Enlightenment values as merely an expression of white supremacy. But this criticism fails to distinguish between ideals and the flawed individuals who advance these ideals. Yes, it would have been lovely had slavery ended immediately at the time that the American Republic was founded, but long-standing institutions and practices do not necessarily come tumbling down overnight. Slavery had existed from time immemorial in almost all human societies. Apart from some isolated sporadic musing by some philosophers through the ages, slavery was almost everywhere accepted. Jesus did not denounce it. Moses, Confucius, and Muhammad all advocated it. The slave trade to the Americas in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s depended on African sellers as much as European buyers. Organized opposition to slavery only began to materialize in the late 1700s in Europe, that is, at the time of the Enlightenment. The tension between the ideals of the Enlightenment and the existence of slavery was not resolved in the United States until the Civil War, but it was resolved in favor of freedom. Had it not been for the Enlightenment, slavery may well have continued, as indicated by its stubborn persistence in various nations that were untouched by the Enlightenment. Saudi Arabia did not ban slavery until 1962. Likewise with women's rights. Recognition of their equal standing was delayed by the endurance of the ages-old belief that women are in some sense inferior to men, especially with respect to reasoning ability. It took time to overcome this prejudice, time and willingness and opportunity to question and challenge this prejudice. Again, Enlightenment values facilitated this process. The 2 greatest moral revolutions in the history of humanity were the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of women. Neither would have happened absent the Enlightenment. Make no mistake, yielding to Christian nationalism will result in severe restrictions on personal liberty, if not outright authoritarian government. What we need are defenders of Enlightenment values, the values that provide the true basis for the freedoms that we cherish today.
If you'd like to support me in creating more of these types of videos, you can do so by donating to the channel through our Patreon page. This will also give you early access to videos and channel updates. You will also get access to our Discord server, where you can participate in discussions and debates with other members of our community. You can check it out by clicking the link in the video description.